Hi, and good morning and good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all and thank you everyone for participating in this CISMOR seminar. I am Ari Ishiguro and will be the moderator of today's seminar. I am an assistant professor of the International Institute of American Studies, and I'm also a research fellow of CISMOR at Dosha University. The seminar today is organized by CISMOR and co-organized by the International Institute of American Studies. Today, we are honored to welcome Professor Marcia Perry, Professor of New York University. To greet Professor Perry, I'd like to ask Professor Adataka Cohen, a professor of the Graduate School of Theology and the director of CISMOR. Professor Cohen, please.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to have this lecture today. I welcome Professor Marcia Pelli, who is a very important scholar on the topic of today, white evangelicals, who are actually playing a very important role in the, I would say, social and political construct of the United States of America population today. So thank you very much, and we are very eager to listen to the lecture. Thank you, Ishiguro Sensei. Hi.
Thank you. Let me introduce our guest speaker. Professor Dr. Marcia Perry is a scholar of religion, politics, and culture. Professor Perry teaches at NYU and holds the Master Guest Professorship in the Theology Department at Humboldt University, Berlin, where she remains an annual guest professor. Besides, Professor Perry has lectured widely at universities and professional associations, among them Oxford University, the Center of Theological Inquiry, Princeton, Free University Berlin, Center of Theology and Philosophy, the Cato Institute, Hebrew Union College, among many others. Professor Perry is on the board of the Berlin Institute of Public Theology and of the Teros Institute, in addition to other advisory positions. Professor Perry has been a columnist and contributor to U.S. and European periodicals, writing for a religion news service, Religion and Ethics, Commonwealth Political Theology Network, The Guardian, The New York Times, Teros Journal, International Politics, Die Deutsche Zeitung, Tageszeitung, and Frankfurter Rundschau, among other periodicals. Professor Perry published numerous books and articles. Let me introduce her latest 3 books. First one is White Evangelicals and Right-Wing Populism. How did we get here? Which was published from Lotte in 2022, and she has also published in 2011. The title is America's New Evangelicals, Expanding the Vision of the Common Good. The book explores America's evangelical communities who have left the writers for a worldview and practice where religious life and liberal democracy are vibrant. And the next one, she published from this Broken Hill, I Sing to You, God, Sex, and Politics in the Work of Leonard Cohen in 2021. Last one is Commonwealth and Covenant Economic Politics and Theologies of Relationality, which was published in 2016. Commonwealth and Covenant was selected by the United Nations Committee on Education for Justice for worldwide distribution and was nominated for a Greenware Award in the region. If you would like to get some more information, please visit Professor Perry's official website. So So finally, please welcome Professor Marcia Perry's lecture on Evangelical Populism, its historical, religious, and political development, and its meaning for U.S. policy. So Professor Dr. Perry, please.
Thank you very much. And good evening, good morning to all of you. It's evening here and morning in Japan. Thank you so much for attending. And I'd like to thank Professor Ada Cohen and everybody at CISMOR and in Japan who made my appearance here today possible. Thank you very much for the invitation and for all your work in organizing this event. I'm going to start on my talk about white evangelical populism and its impact on American society and politics. I will have a PowerPoint, and so I will share my screen to show you the PowerPoint, and we will go back and forth between the lecture and the PowerPoint. So here I will begin by sharing the PowerPoint. Can someone let me know if you can see it?
Yes.
Great, that's wonderful. So I will, with that, I will begin. I think we can come back together. Okay, very good. Here we go. I'd like to begin my discussion with a distinction that is critical to understanding American politics. The American political right wing is not a religious movement. The political right is composed mainly of 2.5 groups. One, well-off and wealthy individuals and businesses, corporations that benefit from small government economics, low taxes, low regulation of business and finance. 2.5 groups. The first, well-off and wealthy individuals and businesses. The second group on the American political right are middle-class and working-class Americans who, owing to historical and cultural wariness of corrupt or oppressive government, understand small governmentism, low taxes, low regulation of business and finance, as their freedom, their freedom from government regulation, from potentially oppressive government. The third group are religious Americans, including conservative Catholics, Protestants, and white evangelicals, who belong to either the first group of the wealthy or the second group of middle and working class Americans. That's the big picture of the American political right wing. Christian nationalism, a term much discussed lately, is a political movement aiming at certain distribution of political power in the US. It holds that the US should be governed according to the political, economic, and social positions of a certain conservative view of Christianity. Though it contains the word Christian, it is not a religion, nor is its focus theological tenets. It does not concern redemption or salvation or the lessons of the cross or the Trinity, etc. Some of its members of Christian nationalists may be religious, Catholic, Protestant, evangelical, etc. Others have a very loose relationship or very small relationship to religious beliefs or practices or communities. And they take the term Christian or evangelical as a socio-political marker of right-wing identification. This talk looks at the worldview and current populist politics, not of the entire right-wing spectrum that I've just described, but of the second group just mentioned, at the populism of middle and working class white Americans and the significant subset who are white evangelicals. White evangelicals are important because they currently comprise 25% of American voters and impact both domestic and foreign policy. 84% voted for Donald Trump in 2020. Had Trump been elected president, US involvement in the Ukraine, considering foreign policy, would have been substantially different from the involvement under President Joe Biden. A significant number of white evangelicals have indeed supported Vladimir Putin, both before the 2022 war began and since then. Regarding white evangelical impact in the US domestic politics, it is popularly thought that white evangelicals are not only authoritarians in embracing Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, but that abortion drives their vote. Neither of these ideas is true.
Sorry, Professor Perry, I'm very sorry. So now we can't see your slide. Could you please share your slide again?
Can you see the slide now?
Yes, yes. So thank you.
Very good. Okay. Abortion does not necessarily drive the white evangelical vote. As you can see, 46% of white evangelicals support the right to legal abortion. In the 2016 presidential election, the factors most important in determining evangelical choice of candidate were the economy and national security. Abortion was most important for half as many evangelicals, and LGBTQ matters for only 16 or 17%. In 2020, the economy was again the highest priority for evangelicals, followed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Abortion, religious freedom, national security were selected by only half as many evangelicals as the most important factor in the election. All other concerns were selected by 8% or less. In short, white evangelical politics is not a unifactorial vote regarding abortion. It is multifactorial, emerging in part from religious concerns and in part from other reasons. What then are the multiple reasons behind white evangelical support for Trump and for right-wing populism more broadly? The question is interesting, especially as Trumpist and Republican policies would seem to violate Christian ethics. For instance, in the 2017 tax cut, the business journal Forbes wrote, "The biggest winners were corporations and households that get income from corporate profits, not the biblical concern for the poorest, the least of these, but advantages for the wealthiest Americans." Said another way, what in white evangelical religious and political history and in present circumstances makes right-wing populism look to be the best path? The rest of this talk hopes to answer this question. I'll begin with some terms and a minimal definition of populism, and then sketch the white evangelical experience through each step of that definition. Our first term is evangelical by belief, defined classically by the Bebbington quadrilateral of biblicalism, crucicentrism, conversionism, and activism. Evangelicalism is not a denomination, but an approach to Protestantism that emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries from the free-thinking and pietistic churches of Europe. It sought a personal relationship to Jesus and to the Bible, that's biblicalism, with an emphasis on the cross as a symbol of salvation and service, crucicentrism, the mission to bring others to that relationship, conversionism, individual reading by ordinary men and women, and the importance of individual conscience rather than following authority. Interestingly, the Gallup poll has developed a similar criteria for identifying those holding to evangelical belief. Our next term is our minimal definition of populism. A minimal definition specifies those patterns necessary to identify a phenomenon as populist, while allowing historical cultural beliefs to follow as second-order features. Following Whitehead and Perry, the minimal definition used here is synthesized from ideational understandings of populism, where populism is defined by the ideas that are believed and promoted. Plus, I'm adding historical, cultural, and socio-psychological approaches. It is hoped that the combination of these approaches illuminates populism more fully than any approach alone would. In our minimal definition, populism may be defined as a way of understanding and responding to way of life, economic, and status loss duresses, present or even anticipated, that finds solution to these duresses in us-them binaries that draw in complex ways from specific historical cultural notions of society, who's us, who's them, and historical cultural notions of government, its proper size and role. A few words unpacking our minimal definition will help our discussion of white evangelical populism. The first is populism as a response to duress and us-them shift. Amira et al. Explain the significant effects of duress on worldview. Quote, while the tendency to help the in-group appears to be primary, under situations of threat to identity, respondents shift gears and opt for harming the out-group, close quote. Under duress, the usual focus on one's own group shifts self-protectively to constraining an other, believed to be the source of the duress. That is, it shifts to forms of us-them thinking. Vamek Vulcan, who studies political extremism, writes, the more stressful the situation, the more neighbor groups become preoccupied with each other, and the greater the likelihood of us-them populist binaries. For instance, analyzing 800 elections in 20 advanced democracies from the 1870s to 2014, Funk et al. Found that quote, financial crises put a strain on democracies. Far-right parties see strong political gains under financial duress. But left populism also gains, as Adam Tooze notes. Quote, the financial and economic crisis of 2007-2012 morphed between 2013 and 17 into a comprehensive political and geopolitical crisis, a dramatic mobilization of both left and right. Under duress, the sense of loss and us-them shift may be sharpest for higher status groups whose position in society has suddenly become less secure. In discussing what they call dominant group victimhood, Reicher and Ulusahin note that it is not status, but status loss that provokes exclusionary and extreme efforts to restore what is believed to be the rightful order of things, often through mainstream politics, precisely because the mainstream politics feel ineffective. Finally, our last explanation, in identifying us, them, populist proposals must be understandable. While new ideas are not precluded from understandability, the most easily grasped proposals are often familiar, drawn in mediated ways from a society's historical cultural background, and from the ways that background may turn to us, them frameworks. This background includes political, socioeconomic, and religious traditions and symbols. In Graham Ward's description, it is the cultural imagination, quote, the subconscious, within which we move and from out of which we try to make sense, even cope with our collective experience, close quote. Traditional and familiar notions of them have not only the feel of familiarity, but of authority, born of tradition and repetition. They feel natural and right. The next sections following our minimal definition will discuss the duresses that Americans face and white evangelicals as a subgroup face. The duresses will be from their perspective, as that is what motivates political activity. We will then discuss the historical cultural resources that may be drawn upon in seeking solutions to duress. And 3, we will look at how resources under duress, these cultural resources, can reform into us, them frameworks that feel familiar and right. So to our first discussion of duress. American evangelicals, as Americans, face the range of pressures that other Americans face, including economic, status loss, and way of life shifts. Economic duress includes and underemployment, especially in old industry regions, prodded somewhat by globalized trade and substantially by automation and productivity gains, accounting for 88% of US job loss and disproportionately burdening those without college degrees. Way of life shifts entail changes in gender roles, technology, demographics, etc. Status loss entails the loss or fear of losing one's respectable place in society and falling below those one is currently above. Those most attracted to the Republican Party between 2010 and 2018 were high school-only whites with middle-class incomes that, in a knowledge-based economy, were afraid their horizons were dimming and that their respectable status in society was under threat. Together, these duresses yield a sense that life is less familiar and fair than a generation ago. I'm going to pause. Can you see my screen?
Yes. Yes, we can. No.
Okay, no, we don't need it anymore. I wanted to switch out of it so I can talk to the group. Okay, great. Now we're back. Great. Together, these duresses yield the sense that life is less familiar and fair than a generation or two ago, and that conditions are changing fast and are determined by those who have captured the country for their own purposes and who care little about one's own circumstances, and who are condescending to boot. In his new book, Why We Did It, a travelogue from the Republican Road to Hell, Republican strategist Tim Miller documents how Trump's Republican enablers cared little about politics that would benefit the nation and were motivated by greed and access to power, and by one more thing, hatred of the left they felt to be condescending to them. This outrage at condescension motivated even Miller's well-off and well-positioned Republican colleagues in Washington. Among the working class populist base, the sense of unfairness and condescension often accompany representational deficiency, where citizens feel ignored by those in government and so are more open to political extremism. This may soon become what I call efficacy deficiency, where people move to the political extremes to at least do something to feel effective on their own behalf, while the elites who condescend don't do anything, while addressing the complex, powerful sources of economic and way of life duress may seem overwhelming and daunting. Efforts against groups traditionally identified as them has path dependency advantage. It may elicit more societal support and may thus provide easy feelings of effectiveness. It makes people feel that they are taking their country back. They are making their America great again. In addition to these duresses that affect many Americans, stressors bearing specifically on white evangelicals include church membership loss and a growing sense of cultural and political marginalization in an increasingly secular, multicultural, and socially liberal country. Americans claiming no religious affiliation are now 29% of the population, 36% of those between ages 18 and 29. By 2070, Christians could comprise only between a half and a third of Americans. White evangelicals have decreased as a share of the population from 23% in 2006 to 14.5% in 2020. More than 2 million have left the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest denomination, since 2006. As Robert Jones of the Public Religion Research Institute notes, quote, a real visceral sense of loss of cultural dominance has set in. In 2020, 66% of white evangelicals felt that Christians face a lot of discrimination in the United States. This present sense of marginalization comes on top of a gradual decrease in cultural dominance since the late 19th century, begun by industrialization, urbanization, changing social norms, and Darwinism. The new German historical critical exegetical methods threaten to unseat America's grassroots but untutored understanding of the Bible. Part of the evangelical response to these challenges in the late 19th century was the embrace of apocalyptic forms of Christianity, including premillenarianism, dispensationalism, and the holiness and Pentecostal movements. These forms of worship were accessible to all, not only to educated elites. And the apocalypticism reflected evangelical anxieties about the future, even as it further isolated evangelicals and reinforced their sense of being sidelined. In short, evangelicalism, which had been at the forefront of much American settlement and culture through the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century found itself in a rearguard action of conserving the past, and more so even rearguard in the 20th century. The acceptance of Darwinism led to the 1925 Scopes Supreme Court trial, which pitted modernists against conservative Christians in the battle over teaching evolution in the public schools. Evangelicals were nationally mocked as benighted primitives. In 1962, the Supreme Court prohibited school-sponsored prayer, and in 1968, it overturned state bans on teaching evolution. In 1990, it rules that religious belief or practice did not exempt one from laws of general applicability, limiting religious exceptions from the law for both individuals and groups. The 1960s youth counterculture in America, the civil rights legislation, the Great Society anti-poverty programs, the worry that Democrats were soft on communism, and then the feminist movement, and then the gay rights movement, furthered white evangelical sense through the 20th century of their loss of cultural dominance. In 1973, abortion was legalized. In 2010, Obama's reform of our healthcare system, the Affordable Care Act, mandated that employers offer birth control in employee health insurance plans. In 2015, the Supreme Court ruled same-sex marriage constitutional. By 2021, 70% of Americans and 55% of evangelicals supported the legality of same-sex marriage. From the white evangelical perspective, the loss of cultural dominance was a growing reality. While opposition to abortion and gay marriage and support for school prayer that I just mentioned are understandable as evangelical ethics, opposition to the 1960s civil rights and anti-poverty programs would seem inconsistent with Christian ethics. Understanding white evangelical opposition to civil rights and anti-poverty programs brings us to our next step in our minimal definition, a look into the historical cultural resources about society and government from which white evangelical populism, it draws its ideas of us and them. The traditional thems are government or associated elites and other, quote, outsiders. The earliest contribution to these historical cultural resources came from Reformed covenantal political theory, brought to the colonies by the Puritans and others dissenting from Europe's state churches. Drawing on the Hebrew Bible, it imagined the polity as a reciprocal covenant among persons and with God. A ruler who violates this covenant with the government may be removed from office. Covenantalists were wary of princes, church authorities, and other outsiders who might disturb their way of life. The Mayflower Compact of 1620 aimed at both establishing covenantal government for early Massachusetts and also constraining non-Puritan, quote, outsiders. The second resource for notions of society and government was Aristotelian republicanism, which also emphasized the community, the polis, and citizen participation in running it. It too was wary and suspicious of tyrants. A third source, liberalism, put less stress on community embeddedness and more on individual freedom, but was equally suspicious of authorities. This wariness was especially persuasive in America, as many immigrants had fled oppressive political and economic systems. The harsh frontier further advised self-reliance, trust in one's local community, and wariness of distant authorities. Even amid industrialization, Henry Bellows in 1872 described, quote, the thousands of American towns with an independent local life of their own, close quote. Together, The experience of immigration and settlement, along with covenantal and Republican and liberal mores, fostered an ethos of self-responsibility, localism, and wariness of government and, quote, outsiders. The widespread resistance to the Constitution, which gave greater powers to Washington than did the earlier Articles of Confederation, was what one expression of the anti-authoritarian localist government wariness. The Shays and Whiskey rebellions at the end of the 18th century were against government regulation and taxation, two other examples of localist anti-government wariness. Wariness of outsiders was seen also as soon as the country began in the 1790 Naturalization Act, limiting citizenship to white immigrants, followed by the Anti-Immigrant, Alien, and Sedition Acts of 1798. The Anti-Immigrant Know-Nothing Party, popular throughout the first half of the 19th century, impressively won 22% of a five-party race for the House of Representatives in 1854. Restrictive immigration laws were enacted in 1873, 1882, and 1924. Until the 1964 Civil Rights legislation and 1965 Voting Rights Act, discrimination and voting restrictions targeted African Americans, but also immigrants from Asia, Mexico, and Southern and Eastern Europe. Localism's most tragic fruition came with the Civil War, fought over both the slave system and Washington's role in state and local governance. But the Southern response to defeat was itself grounded in localism and anti-Washington animus. After the Reconstruction period, 1865 to 75, white Southerners gained control, and the Confederacy was imagined into a lost cause of noble resistance to the interloper Northern suspect Yankee vandals, in this lost cause, reimagining of the Old South, a Christianized white supremacy and suspicion of Washington together formed white pride and identity, again animating wariness of Americans' foundational government, foundational thems in an us-them framework. Government, who are the thems? Government and other outsiders, usually new immigrants and minorities. Though federal government grew along with the nation, localism and wariness of Washington and outsiders retain a vaunted place in American identity and practice. Can you see my PowerPoint? Just checking.
Yes, we can see.
Great. What about the historical cultural background specifically for white evangelicals? The ancestors of today's evangelicals were informed by the history I've just described, but they also contributed to it. As covenantal thinkers, they left Europe with the heritage of community responsibility. As Europe's persecuted minorities, they arrived with the dissenters' wariness and suspicion, again, of government and outsiders. And they held to two important doctrinal principles: the fallenness of human government and personal responsibility to come to moral truth, rather than following priestly authority. As all human governments are imperfect, each individual must work out how to witness God's vision, a belief that encouraged personal moral reckoning and, again, suspicion of authority and outsiders. In short, white American evangelicals are bequeathed a double source of government and outsider wariness, both political and doctrinal. With this double caution, they became prime builders of America's government-wary, self-reliant republic. Evangelicals were central in the First Great Awakening, 1730s to 1740s, a festival of iconoclastic religious ideas preached by self-appointed men and some women, calling for radical self-examination that relied not even on one's own church. Evangelicals on the whole supported the revolution against Britain. Arminianism, Methodism's forerunner, reimagined the Calvinist emphasis on God's grace to accent each person's own agency in her salvation, an emphasis well suited to self-reliant America. As Americans' most influential denomination of the 19th century, Methodism spurred evangelical anti-authoritarianism, localist anti-federalism, and localist Jeffersonian and Jacksonian politics, with ministers becoming central figures in populist agrarian, anti-elite, and anti-landlord protest. The largest US government office before the Civil War was the Postal Service. By 1850, evangelical churches had double the employees, twice as many facilities, and raised 3 times as much money for their projects. Northern evangelicals were often vocal abolitionists against slavery, and Southerners were often defenders of the slave system in Christian voice, both groups strong advocates for their local communities. After the Civil War, the lost cause of the Confederacy, robust throughout the South, was reinforced and celebrated in the parades honoring the Confederacy through Christian dogma, in children's catechisms glorifying the defeated Confederacy, and in the statues and stained glass church windows, ubiquitous through the Southern US. Looking at the sources of white evangelical duress and the cultural resources with which to respond, we may say that white evangelicals are bequeathed double of both, double of duress and double of resources. One, a twofold source of duress, the economic way of life challenges that many Americans feel, plus religio-cultural loss of dominance. And they face a twofold source of government and outsider wariness, political and doctrinal, from which they may draw the thems of an us-them response to duress. While government and outsider wariness has been present since the 17th century, the accumulating pressures of the 20th century aggravated the white evangelical sense of loss and the appeal of us-them frameworks. As white evangelicals, like others under duress, draw upon cultural resources to identify us and them, commitment to community, foundational in American and evangelical history and culture, may become a self-protective my community in struggle against outsiders, new immigrants and minorities, who are threats to be constrained. Wariness of oppressive governments and elites, also foundational to the American and evangelical experience, may become suspicion of government elites per se, whose activities should be limited except to constrain the outsiders of point number 1. Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Great. In short, the irony of white evangelical populism is that the very anti-authoritarianism in community building that contributed much to American vibrancy and that our evangelical heritage by history and doctrine may, under conditions of duress, turn to protective us-them worldviews and practices. It is a shift that is both common under duress and tragic, as it yields solution to duress that emerge from the distortions that duress itself prods, the shift from community to exclusionary community, and the shift from wariness of oppressive government to wariness of government itself. The next section will look at a few examples of how us-them shift informs the politics of many Americans and then of white evangelicals. One expression of government wariness is the gun rights movement in America. Though Americans use guns for a range of reasons, sport, self-protection, a prime motivator for the political mobilization in support of gun rights is resistance to tyrannical government. Currently, for example, Congressional Representative Matt Gaetz holds that the Second Amendment to the Constitution, quote, is about maintaining within the citizenry the ability to maintain an armed rebellion against the government, close quote. In late December of 2020, just before the January 6th riot at the US Capitol building, Representative Lauren Boebert similarly said that the Second Amendment, quote, has nothing to do with hunting, unless you're talking about hunting tyrants. Outside Congress, in the intellectual circles of the right, David French explained in the National Review that, quote, an assault weapons ban would gut the concept of an armed citizenry as the final emergency bulwark against tyranny, close quote. 3/4 of American gun owners associated gun ownership with freedom. Government wariness combines with wariness of outsiders, minorities, new immigrants, in opposition to federal aid for social services, even among those who benefit from those social services. Though Democrats seek more government involvement in addressing societal needs than Republicans do, nonetheless, 83% of Americans say they do not trust Washington. 75% hold that the free market and not government should be responsible for technical innovation. 62% say the same for wealth distribution and the economy overall, and wages. Though increasing numbers of Americans benefit from government programs, resistance to them has grown on the perception that, quote, other people, perceived as undeserving lazy minorities and immigrants, are being given our tax dollars by the corrupt, the corrupt federal government, combining suspicion of outsiders with suspicion of government. Where these views are embraced, sociologist Suzanne Mettler writes, whites, including those who benefit from government aid, vote to restrict it. As Benjamin Applebaum and Robert Gebeloff write in the New York Times, quote, they are frustrated that they need help, feel guilty for taking it, and resent the government for providing it, close quote. In 2020, 57% of Republicans held that whites face a lot of discrimination in America. 64% held that immigrants compete with Americans for jobs. 72% felt immigrants use more than their share of social services. And 63% felt that immigrants increase crime. These views hold even when economic and law enforcement records do not support them. For instance, immigrant communities commit fewer crimes than native-borns. Of the 40 million people who qualified for the largest benefits under Joe Biden's American Rescue Plan, most were not people of color. 17.3 million were white, and less than half that number were Black, 8.2 million, and 10.1 million were Hispanic. Moreover, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine has found that high levels of immigration negatively affect the income only of teenagers without a high school degree, but not of other sectors of the population. And it concludes in its report, quote, immigrants' children, the second generation, are among the strongest economic and fiscal contributors to the population, in the population, close quote. With these sketches of government and outsider wariness of Americans overall, we can turn to the influence of government and outsider wariness on white evangelicals. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. A key moment in the evangelical arc from duress to us then populism was the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which was government-enforced racial integration that animated the dual suspicions of government and minorities and outsiders. It was followed by the big government, great society social service programs that expanded the role of Washington against evangelical suspicion of big government. The Republican New Right promised relief: small government economics, social conservatism, resistance to outsider, in quotes, destruction of local norms and laws, and an anti-communist foreign policy to defeat the biggest of big governments, communist government, in the perception of the New Right evangelicals. Understanding this as the best political and ethical path, 2/3 of white evangelicals in 1980 voted for the New Right candidate, Ronald Reagan, whose policy priorities were the reduction of government, small governmentism, through tax cuts and business deregulation, as well as exhausting the Soviet Union by outspending it on weapons. Since Reagan, white evangelicals have given strong majorities to the Republican Party, from a low of 62% in the 1996 presidential race to a high of 84% in 2020. In 2000, 79% of evangelicals voted for George W. Bush, whose major domestic achievement was again business deregulation and tax cuts. This was not an anti-abortion vote, with Republican small governmentism as a tag-along extra. This was a small government political and economic stance. Making the Bush tax cuts permanent was a legislative priority of the Christian Coalition, the largest evangelical umbrella organization of the day. Evangelical support for George W. Bush rose 10 points between 2000 and 2004 without any national legislation limiting abortion, even when the Republicans controlled both the presidency and Congress. In the 21st century, the domestic stressors that we have discussed, economic way of life, in gender roles and demographics, etc., started to destabilize the traditional place of the white breadwinner male. As Kristen Dumais has detailed, one response was a sharpening of long-standing us-them frameworks for which the Christian warrior was now needed, supported by women who are passive, sexually pure, yet sexually accommodating within marriage. A scan of popular guides to evangelical living gives some indication of the white male sense of embattlement and the gendered and racialized thems at the battlefront. You have a list of them in front of you on the PowerPoint. White evangelical sense of societal destabilization was aggravated by the election of the first African-American president. In addition to increasing the presence of people of color and women in positions of authority, Barack Obama expanded government's role in business regulation and social assistance against white evangelical preference for small government. White evangelical radio host Red Metaxas responded with traditional anti-Washington, anti-elite, and anti-outsider animus laced with Christianized white supremacy. He said, Beltway, meaning Washington, D.C., and Manhattan elites perpetrate a new and accepted tribalism and xenophobia upon white European Christian varieties of people, close quote. Similar and even more strident views are frequent in both mainstream social media and radical platforms such as Gab, CloutHub, Natural News, and Brighteon. Gab founder Andrew Torba writes of the great spiritual war for a new parallel Christian society, close quote. He envisions either recreation of America as a Christian nation or seceding from the United States. He calls his support for the January 6th riot at the US Capitol building, which sought to overthrow the election of Joe Biden, as, quote, a silent Christian secession, close quote. Accompanying the sharpening suspicion of government over the last half century were racist and xenophobic suspicions of outsiders, quote unquote. As this is well documented, I'll mention just one historical moment and then turn to recent events. When in 1948, the Democratic Party adopted the integrationist Harry Truman as their presidential candidate, Southern Democrats launched a new Dixiecrat party with a platform that challenged both Washington and racial integration, a rather spot-on expression of America's two thems. The Dixiecrat political platform read, "We stand for the segregation of the races and the racial integrity of each race. We oppose the control of private employment by federal bureaucrats called for by the misnamed Civil Rights Program. We favor home rule, local self-government, and a minimum interference with individual rights." More recently, populist outsider wariness has been voiced in the white evangelical support for the white supremacist cry, "You, new immigrants and Jews, will not replace us," close quote. Their support for the Confederacy as a symbol of white identity and pride. Their support for the of Trump's border wall to stanch immigration. And the Latino threat narrative, as Jamie Langazel calls it, the narrative of honest, hardworking white communities overrun by manipulative, lawless, lazy foreigners. In 2021, Russell Moore stepped down as head of the Southern Baptist Convention's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission after he had disagreements with them over race relations and sexual abuse cases. The presenting issue here, Moore wrote, is that first and foremost of sexual abuse. At the same time, the other absolutely draining and unrelenting issue has been that of racial reconciliation. Moore continued, my family and I have faced constant threats from white nationalists and white supremacists, including within our own convention. Some of them have been involved in neo-Confederate activities for years. Some are involved with groups funded by white nationalist nativist organization. Some have just expressed raw racist sentiment behind closed doors. Importantly, the link between outsider animus, racist views, and white Christian self-identification is strongest among faith groups that have historically been dominant, white evangelicals in the South and white Catholics in the Northeast. Echoing the research on dominant group victimhood, these findings by the Public Religion Research Institute suggest that under duress, formerly dominant groups, those most experiencing losses, shift most to us-them binaries. Reflecting this experience, this year, 78% of Republicans and 52% of Democrats who identify as white evangelical or born again favor declaring the United States a Christian nation. In 2020 and 2021, 75% of white evangelicals held that Islam is at odds with American values, 20 points higher than any other group. 66% thought of newcomers to the country as, quote, invaders, compared to only 36% of Americans overall. 57% prefer living in a country where most people are Christian. No other religious group comes within 20 points of this majority. In 2015, when Trump was first running for president, government and outsider wariness were not new, but they were animated by Trump and others who tapped into and reinforced suspicion of America's traditional thems. Let's recall what Trump promised: to fight against, quote, the deep state, against, quote, the DC swamp of, quote, government insiders and their elite fake news media. He promised he would rid America of Mexican, quote, rapists and drug dealers, close quote, of Muslim terrorists and foreigners who would cheat America in trade. Trump cut taxes, social services, and business regulation on the grounds that they are big government overreach. He framed medical information about COVID-19 mask wearing as government infringement on religious and personal freedom. In his 2020 election campaign, he warned that if the Democrats won the White House, they would take away, quote, freedom of speech, close quote, drawing on America's historical fear of tyrannical government. Since the 2020 election, Trump has accused, quote, the deep state and, quote, the regime, close quote, of stealing the presidency from him. As the January 6th riot to overturn the 2020 election demonstrates, people are willing to fight hard for the guy they believe is fighting for them against the enemies they know from history and culture. This is not an embrace of authoritarianism, but from the white evangelical perspective, it's opposite. It is a fight for their freedom. As Tony Perkins, president of the Conservative Family Research Council, explained, white evangelicals were, quote, tired of being kicked around by Barack Obama and his leftists, close quote, and they were, quote, finally glad that there's somebody on the playground that is willing to punch the bully, close quote. That somebody in 2016 was Donald Trump, willing to punch the bully of big government in Washington and other outsiders. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. In conclusion, those white evangelicals who believe with wariness of government, born of history and doctrine, that well-being hangs on constraining the state, saw Trump's tax cuts and reduction of social services and business regulation. He placed onto the Supreme Court 3 justices who support both smaller government and religious practice in the public sphere. White evangelicals, on the grounds of small governmentism and shielding localities from, quote, outsiders, may also hold that well-being hangs on limiting government, but not only limiting government, but also other intruders, close quote. They saw Trump's tax cuts, reductions in social services and business regulation, plus protectionist trade policies, xenophobic immigration protocols, and encouragement to those who would seek to constrain, quote, outsiders and minorities. After the Charlottesville, Virginia clash between white supremacists and their political opponents, Trump declared that there were very fine people on both sides, quote, unquote. White evangelicals weigh economic and socio-political interests along with religious ones. Such as opposition to gay marriage, for example. Their votes are multifactorial. Like the votes of all Americans, they represent a composite of concerns, with political and economic issues among the prime drivers of political activity. But white evangelical duresses and their resources and frameworks for addressing them may be animated by those who stand to benefit politically and economically from small governmentism and the suppression of minority and new immigrant voices. In America, there's a name for that. It's called hunting where the ducks are. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Professor Perry, for insightful lecture. So now we have about 20 minutes for Q&A and discussion session. So please raise your hand for questions and comments, or you can type that in the chat box. Are there any questions or comments?
I think Hideyuki Kaguya has a question.
Yes, please. So sorry.
Thank you. Thank you for your excellent lecture. Since I am studying biblical hermeneutics, I am interested in the way American people interpret the biblical text. If I'm not mistaken, in the beginning of the lecture, you told us that right-wing evangelical populists do not always have Christian beliefs. Am I correct?
Let me just restate, in the what is called the American political right, some are Christian, some are evangelical, some are Catholic, and some are not religious. That's a political movement. However, you heard correctly that some political right-wingers who call themselves Christian nationalists or Christians have a very thin or attenuated connection to any actual biblical study, practice, or community. And they use the term Christian as a socio-political marker.
Mm-hmm.
We noticed that between 2016, when Trump first ran, and 2020, when he ran again, that there was an uptick in Trump supporters who in 2016 did not call themselves evangelical or Christian, and in 2020 suddenly did. And so in doing research on white evangelicals, it's important to distinguish between people who take the label as a socio-political identifier and those who actually have in-depth involvement with the Bible and with religious practice and communities.
Thank you so much. I mean, I just couldn't understand why some people can become evangelical without belief. Yeah.
Yes. So, yes, it is curious, and yet evangelical has become a socio-political marker in the United States. And this is recognized by a wide range of people that unfortunately confuses the research, because if you ask people to check on the box, are they evangelical? They may check yes, but that question alone will not tell you about their engagement with biblical study or communities of practice, etc. You have to ask further questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Any other question or comment? Professor Cohen, Adataga Cohen, please.
For me, I mean, first of all, thank you very much. It was fascinating having the real numbers and the percentage of what is really happening alongside with the way of thinking and I would say presumption of the reality. For me, what really is in a sense shocking from what's happening in the United States is how can these kind of people rely on a person who is actually telling, I'm sorry to say, but lies, that he's telling them all kinds of things that are not true, that are not real, and they still go and follow up whatever he is saying. So that's a very big problem for me. Do they not see the reality? I mean, yes, we could see on TV how they are illusioned, in my way of understanding, but could you speak a little bit more about that?
Thank you. So both of these have been very important questions. In in my research and across both political science and sociology of religion, it's very clear that people's political motivation is prodded by their belief system. And belief system is much sturdier than what you would call facts. So close to 2/3 of American Republicans believe that the 2020 election was fraudulent and stolen from Donald Trump. Even though this was disproved in between 60 and 70 court cases, twice by the Supreme Court and by Trump's own Attorney General, William Barr. But the belief persists. And we all know, as we study cultures and societies, that beliefs can persist that are not supported by reality if they satisfy some important sociological or psychological or emotional need. And the situation for many Americans now who face a wide variety of durresses, economic, way of life, status loss, the things that I reviewed, plus all of those for white evangelicals, but also for them a real sense of having lost their culturally dominant position. And under those conditions of duress, there is a real need, or there is a real tendency, as the psychiatrists and psychologists explain, there is a tendency to us-them shift, and then you identify the thems from your cultural and historical background, whether or not the reality supports that. And we can see that in many, 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 many cultures historically and as well today, that people select a them to be against that explains their current duresses, whether or not that is the correct diagnosis. What I have again found in my field work with white evangelicals is that people are generally quite good in knowing when they are being harmed, economically, socially. They are quite good in knowing the harm. They are less good in identifying the source of that harm and therefore relief that would address the original harm. So between duress and identifying the source of the harm, there's where belief system comes in and can often supersede what you would call reality or facts. A very clear example is the example regarding economic loss and immigration. There are many working class and lower middle class Americans whose economic base has been eroded over the last 40 years, owing in part to globalized trade, but in the last 20 years, much more owing to automation, AI, and productivity gains. Meaning that their job loss is not being caused by immigration. In fact, immigrants are disproportionately entrepreneurial job creators in the United States. And yet, the sense of protesting against a global technological change seems overwhelming. And so people will shift to a them, an enemy, a source of duress they know, which helps them explain what is happening to them and give them a course of action that seems doable you can pressure Congress to reduce immigration. That's much easier than trying to halt automation and global technological progress. So people who are suffering from efficacy deficiency, they don't feel effective. They can't see a way to be effective in their own lives. Will go to familiar us-them frameworks. And the tragedy that I feel is that people will often choose a them and therefore a course of action that tragically does not address the original source of duress. So the duress continues and the cycle keeps going. The duress continues, it prods us-them shift. People look for sources of the duress. They choose, if they make a choice that doesn't address the original problem, we're right back at the beginning of the cycle and it continues to go on.
Thank you from me. If there is there's one more question.
Yeah, next, Dr. Doran Cohen, please.
Thank you very much. In every society, we look at there are paradoxes. And from an outsider view, one of the paradoxes of America is that it seems such a religious country. God is always mentioned in every context. And everybody seems to have some kind of a religious affiliation. But on the other side, you say, and others say, yeah, that religious commitment is going down all the time. So how do we explain this paradox? I know it's a big question, but maybe you can give a short answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Another wonderful question. For me, I don't think it's a paradox. I think it's a question of timeline and history. So America has been perhaps the most religiously committed of all the first world economies for a very long time, largely because religion in America was not associated in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries with the monarchies and aristocracies as it was in Europe. It was a people's thing. It was grassroots. It was our religion, not the king's religion, our religion, not the government's religion, not the state church, our religion, a grassroots development of religion in America. So America remained very religiously committed when in Europe, democratization tended to also reduce involvement in the church because the church had been involved in with the monarchies and aristocracies. As you democratize, there was also resistance to religious elites. Not so in America. However, recently, really within the last 10 years, we've started to see a recent drop in a religious affiliation. Again, those claiming no religious affiliation are about 29% today. That's recent and a dramatic uptick, and 36% of younger Americans. But again, this is not a paradox with culture, it's just a recent turn. Final comment, one must be very careful in America when people say they are not religiously affiliated. That doesn't mean they don't believe in God or spirituality. It just means they are not going to an official church. And that remains now a very fruitful area for research. How many of those unaffiliated say that they believe in God or a higher power, or that spirituality is very important to them? And many of them would say all three of those things. And this is now a new and important area of of research. As the unaffiliated increase, we need to do more research to see what their spiritual lives really are.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are any other question or comment? Professor Hermansen, please.
Yes. Can you hear me? Thank you. So thank you very much for an eye-opening lecture. I want to go on, I think, somewhat where Ada talked, namely, I mean, some years ago, there was this anti-1% movement in America, the very rich. And I mean, even if you are evangelical and local, you can see that others are benefiting from you financially speaking, and they are not non-whites and they are not outsiders. So what do they do with that kind of, don't they feel any anger with that? Or do they just accept it as a continuation of the American dream? Thank you.
Okay, terrific question. And the answer is both. So, of course, working class and middle class Americans, both evangelical and not, recognize that there's increasing wealth gap, increasing income gap in the United States. The very rich are getting very richer, and the middle class, which used to be the largest class in America, is no longer the largest class in America. Many have fallen down and a few have gone up. And you mentioned actually two correct ways that people understand it. One is there's enormous resentment that's part of the duress that I was talking about. Underemployment, or feeling their economic horizons are dimming, or their kids' economic horizons are dimming, or they feel a loss that they used to have a secure place in the middle class and they don't anymore, breeds tremendous resentment against the very rich and wealthy elites and corporations. Now the question is, who do they identify is the source of this problem? And it's very difficult. This is to get Americans to say that the source of that problem is the kind of financial and economic arrangements that are allowing this increasing wealth and income gap. That would require government intervention in finance and in the economy to regulate business to prevent this increasing gaps in wealth and income. And Americans find it very, very difficult to accept government intervention in the economy from the reasons that I discussed. This really, this deep-seated suspicion of government that goes back to the earliest days of America in the 17th century. And go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to say that 100 years ago in Japan experienced a similar situation, and there were no expectations of the government to do anything because the government was known to support those in power. Therefore, people and Christians in our area too joined together to protest, and in labor unions and in social movements. And that's a local initiative that would seem to fit with what you just told us is characteristic of these evangelicals, that they would stand together against the whatever kinds of oppressors there are, not just government, but also outsiders who are exploiting them. Sorry, I'm just asking.
So very interesting. So two things. we saw that 100 years ago and 140 years ago in the United States too. We had a strong labor movement from the 1880s all the way through the Depression. And in those days, you could be an evangelical and a socialist. The turn among evangelicals to the political right began very slowly at the end of the 19th century, and then much more rapidly after the 1960s for the reasons that I described: the civil rights movement, Great Society, poverty programs, the women's movement, the gay movement, the anti-Vietnam War protests, etc., pushed white evangelicals to the new right solution. There's an interesting conflation in America that Americans, on one hand, some Americans resent the very wealthy if they feel that the very wealthy aren't playing fair, that there isn't a level playing field and they're not playing fair. On the other hand, and here's a paradox, a real paradox, Americans also admire the very rich, especially if they made it on their own. And they see in that the opportunities of freedom in America, that you can make it big. So Americans have a very ambivalent attitude about constraining the wealthy. And they have a very strong suspicion against having the government constrain the wealthy. So then you can get local protests, but they're not very effective in addressing the systemic issues of the duresses that we've been talking about. I hope that helps a little bit.
Well, is it okay with Professor Hermansen? Oh, okay. Unfortunately, the time is up. But I'm really sorry. But hopefully, we have another lecture next time in person near future. So please give Professor Perry a big hand. So thank you so much for your incredible lecture, and I'd like to thank you all for your taking time out of your business schedule and to be here today. So thank you so much again. So have a good day and have a almost have a good night. So thank you so much.